Welcome to Manager Tools. Case Study Interviews, Part 2. Here we go. Today's cast answers these questions. What is a case study interview? What kinds of questions are there in case study interviews? How can I prepare for a case study interview? Well, if you want answers to these questions and more, keep listening.
When it comes to communication, it's easy to think of yourself as good enough. After all, you've been doing it your entire life and it's gotten you this far. But the way that human beings build trust and in turn relationships is by constantly communicating with one another. So while you are good in your own right, there's no harm in a little bit of improvement. Join us at one of our Effective Communicator conferences to take your communication skills to the next level. Register today at manager-tools.com/training.
So, a good start might sound like this, and we'll walk you through it. And note that this is done verbally with some calculations done maybe when you're pausing or while you're talking. So the two basic parameters I need to establish here are volume that can be filled and volume of the objects filling it. I'll have to estimate both, with probably more certainty around the golf ball. It's more than 1.5 inches, spreading one's fingers while you're about that far when you're speaking, but it's less than 2 inches. I'm going to roughly split the difference and round down to 1.6 inches in diameter, or 0.8 inches of radius. By the way, folks, because we know radius is needed and even-ended numerals are slightly easier to work with, right? We're choosing 1.6 to get to 0.8 rather than choosing 1.7. If we choose 1.7 as the estimate, now we have a dimension of radius of 0.85, which again gives us an extra decimal to work with. The volume of a single golf ball then is 4/3 times 3.14 estimation of pi. We don't recommend you do 3.1415, 4/3 times pi times 0.8 times 0.8. That's 2.7 cubic inches, okay? And by the way, you could, if you wanted, do 4/3 times 3 times 0.8 times 0.8. And the beauty of that one is the threes cancel out. And it's 0.8 times 0.8, which is 0.64. You should know 8 times 8 is 64, and you move the decimal. 0.64 times 4. That's pretty fast math. And by the way, if you chose to do that, they would have not a problem with it. For the other parameter, total volume, I'll assume the question derives in part from a cargo transportation problem, meaning I won't consider wing volume because if we're going to transport these things, requires the fuel to transport them to be stored in the wings. If I had to estimate wing volume for storing the balls, I don't know why, I couldn't be as precise as I'd like, but I could assume a rough estimate of a rectangular cross section times a length estimate. And further, I will use the entire space of the fuselage rather than roughly half of it. In other words, I will assume there is not a passenger compartment. I'll assume the fuselage is roughly a circle, which would make sense from the strength perspective. And folks, if you think about it, modern RJs, regional jets, they are a circle. It's a great architectural decision to do it. And the volume of that space is 1/2 the radius squared times pi times the length of the cylinder, whatever it is. That's the math for a cylinder. Again, even if you didn't know the math for a cylinder, you should be able to figure out the area of a circle. That would be expected knowledge times the length. So now we're doing the math, if you will, and following our assumptions for the fuselage. To estimate the radius, I'll consider the passenger cabin to be created by a line bisecting the total fuselage, again, which makes sense from a strength perspective, and also that follows from the perception of the shape of the fuselage inside the cabin. I know I've sat in many airplanes, and I've noticed that the side of the airplane around me starts to curve above me rather than it's still curving out because the passenger cabin is set so low that the window is far away from my shoulder because the body is curving out. If I assume coach seat arrangements, just picturing them in my head, in a row of across this is how I'm estimating the radius or the diameter of the circle that I'm assuming. If I assume a coach seat arrangement, I'm thinking it's usually 3 seats and then there's an aisle, and then there are 4 seats, and then an aisle, and then 3 more seats. And by the way, folks, those 2 aisles were incredibly important historically in airline design. That's a total of 10 seats, 4 plus 3 plus 3, and 2 rows. Now, I'm a big guy, so the way I fit into a seat, I'm going to estimate coach seat widths to be 18 inches. This is my gut estimate, okay? Well, based on how wide my backside is. And to tell you the truth, I don't think that's an unreasonable estimate for the aisles, too, when I think about it. When I walk down the aisle, if I don't turn sideways, nobody can squeeze by me, which is generally true of me sitting in my seat. The diameter, then, of this plane is 12 times 18 inches, or 18 feet, right? 12 times 18. But probably it's smarter to keep my units the same. And frankly, folks, just between you and I don't like feet. I can do metrics, but I'm not as good at it as I could. And frankly, I also know that in the US, if this question were being asked in the US, the measurements I could easily get for these things would be in non-metric use. And I like keeping my units the same so I don't inadvertently get a unit mistake into my answer, which could be an order of magnitude. The difference between an inch and a foot is about an order of magnitude. So I'm going to say we've got 18 feet, 12 inches in a foot, 216 inches. Half of that is 108 inches. And I'm going to round that down to 100. I estimate a 747 fuselage to be roughly 250 feet. I do that because it seems about right. I would guess it's not quite an entire football field, which would be 300 feet. But on the other hand, when I think in my head, is it 200 feet, which is only about 60 yards, that doesn't seem enough. So I'm going to say it's 250 feet long. And I do that in part because I know I've done the math in my head as I'm talking. If I multiply 250 times 12, I get 3,000. Something that is 250 feet long is 3,000 inches. I love all those zeros. Okay. So now our estimated volume is 3.14 times 10,000, which is 100 squared, times 3,000. And I could make it even easier by getting rid of that 3.14, right? That is roughly 47 million cubic inches, which seems daunting and huge and everything, but if we made it as yards or meters, it wouldn't seem all that much. Now look, I could simply divide at this point. I could divide the number of cubic inches in the fuselage by the volume of the golf balls, of a golf ball, and get a number. And that would be how many golf balls would fit. That would leave out what I sense is not an insignificant effect of the spherical golf balls, each taking up some space, but also the space between the balls. We're close enough now that I ought to be careful about that. So I think of this as I lay a bunch of golf balls down. Let's say I lay down an array of golf balls, 6 by 6, close together, like they were in an egg tray. Okay, a flat tray of 6 by 6, 36 golf balls. And then I put 36 golf balls on top of them. If I had them in a tray like a pool rack for 15 pool balls, what would happen is the balls would all shift. Generally, let's assume there's some non-randomness here. They would shift and sit in the spaces between the other balls.
Right. We're going to shake the 747 before we call it.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. So my guess is there's an overlap of about 20% of the volume of the spheres when they lay next to one another.
Now, did you do a bunch of complicated math?
Nope.
I
just looked at it, thought about 2 golf balls. The way to do it is you'd take 3 golf balls, put them in a small enclosed space, put another golf ball on top of them, just one, and see how much of the top golf ball is below the top of the bottom golf balls, and vice versa. So I'm going to say it's 20%. So if I discount the volume the balls take up by 20%, that means whatever simple gross volume divided by all item volume, I'd have to multiply by 1.25. Don't say 1.2, it'd be 1.25, right? In result, with all those simplifying assumptions, in my head, I'm hopeful I've canceled out, I've rounded up and rounded down and so on, is 47 million cubic inches divided by 2.7 cubic inches times 1.25, total golf balls, 21.7 million golf balls. But more importantly, relatively easy calculations, all done with a pencil and paper, and the process of estimation and simplifying assumptions explained clearly throughout.
Did you check your math on this to see how close you got? Do you know what the actual answer is?
I'll tell you two things about my experience writing that part of the cast. I chose one that I thought would be fun because a lot of people know I like golf. And I happen to I think aircrafts are really cool.
And you fly a lot, so.
Yeah. So it seemed good. Ping pong balls would have been the same, but it didn't have the joy for me.
And you didn't account for the dimples, by the way. I just want to say.
Yeah, actually, you don't. If you think about it for a little bit, you don't have to.
Oh, okay.
The dimples don't affect how much space the golf ball takes up. But I tried very hard to make assumptions that made sense. And I even mentioned a couple of assumptions that I didn't make, rounding pi down to 3. Now, if you start making assumptions like this, as a general rule, if you've made an assumption that is low, on the next one, you want to make one that's high in order to balance things out. A lot of people go through this process and all of their clarifying assumptions are too low or are rounded down, and you end up with a multiplication of rounding down errors, not suggesting we need you to be precise. And in your process, that's seen as a bit of negative. I didn't actually think about that as I was going through because I didn't want people to think I was being persnickety throughout. I didn't check my math. I used a pencil and a piece of paper. Actually, in many cases, I did the math in my head. Okay. And I have no idea whether any of the guesses that I made are really close, although golf ball is probably closest. I've spent a lot of time with a golf ball between my thumb and index finger. Now, look, guys, part of the reason I did this, I was about halfway through it. I said, oh, you know what? I need to check this. And I said, no, let's let the community check it. If you want to troubleshoot or sharpshoot the answer I did, and I have written here our answer, but it's not fair to Mike. Mike would probably be better at this than me.
No, I'd absolutely take credit for what you just went through.
Yeah.
I thought it was pretty good.
So if you want to troubleshoot my answer, our answer, send mail. We look forward to it. I feel lucky that when I said 250 feet and I did the math, it became 3,000 inches. I'm like, wow. To tell you the truth, if I had discovered that, let's say I said it was 240 feet, and so therefore the inches were 2950, I might have rounded up to 3,000 inches, but that doesn't make the 250 guess wrong. It's just a guess anyway. So that is the estimation question. And I'm telling you guys, if you get asked this for most of the jobs that we would talk about day to day on Maneater Tools, for the vast majority of people in America, if you get asked an estimation question, it's probably wasted. And you probably have an interviewer who's grandstanding. They might as well ask you, if you were a tree, what would you be? Or what color would you be? There's no empirical evidence suggests there are better answers. Whereas in behavioral interviewing, we have a lot of data which suggest a person who masters a behavioral interview is much more likely to be effective, successful in the job you're hiring for, assuming you've done a good analysis of the behaviors that lead to success in the job. And I find them fun. And part of the reason I find them fun is when I first hear the question, how many barbershops are there in Atlanta? There's a little bit of, not panic, but fear, like, oh God, how do I know that? And I actually have learned through the process of estimation questions how you don't need to know that, but you do need to know various ways you could get to it. And by the way, there's a number of ways to get to it. You could start with the population of Atlanta and how often you estimate people get their haircut. You could do it by the number of licenses. You could do it by the distance between them and the geographical size of the city. There are all kinds of ways to get to that number. And if you feel a little bit of uncertainty when you get the question, that's okay. It's fine. But again, you make some assumptions. You keep track of your assumptions so they're not all rounded up or rounded down. And you follow the math. And you do it verbally. And the interviewer will give you credit for a reasonable, thoughtful process and not care too much about the number. Frankly, though, I am fairly certain that somebody at some time will put ping pong balls, not golf balls, they're too heavy, ping pong balls into a fuselage. I bet somebody at Boeing has done it. Maybe not with the 747. And it's probably a much different number.
Anybody who works for Boeing, that would be an awesome story to include at Manager Tools. Take pictures, please. Please take pictures.
Feel free to expense the ping pong balls and then tell them it's just for your Manager Tools community. Okay. So that's one type of quantitative assessment. The other, less common quantitative assessment is called a quantitative test. It's typically a timed test with pencil and the printed test as your tools. And by the way, it's typically multiple choice to allow computer scoring, though not always. You get to use the blank spaces on the test paper for calculations and notes, but you don't get to bring in scratch paper. It's important to note here, guys, most of these tests' most significant parameters is time. If you have 30 questions and 60 minutes, that gives you 2 minutes per question. Now, because they're business questions, they're probably going to involve different units, order of magnitudes, percentages, growth and decline rates. They're typically a combination of some presentation of data, a chart, a spreadsheet excerpt, with word questions about the data presented. Did you remember in school where you hated word questions? Yeah, we're back to word questions now, which we'll talk more about. Consider a chart you've got in front of you with 7 columns listing only percentages of various components of revenues by region and product type. And here's the question. If you assume that all revenues from overseas will be taxed at lower rates and the overseas lower rates are listed, lower rates than the domestic market rate, which is listed, what increase in overseas revenue would match tax effects of a similar increase in the domestic market? Now, when we told you 30 questions in 60 minutes for math, you might say, okay, when you read that question, okay, that sounds a little harder. Probably most of us could walk to the chart, think through the calculations. We could add up the various foreign market data, compare it to the domestic tax rate. But there may be 5 to 6 calculations involved, each with percentages. You'd probably do them slowly. I would. And then you double check your work, because any error in math, even assuming you've done the correct interpretation of the figures that are presented, any error would lead to a wrong answer. This is not an estimation question. This is math. And that won't work. We have to do the problems quickly and without estimation, okay? What's more, some questions will be multiple choice, requiring us not only to get correct answers to our calculations, but then compare those answers to aggregations of some of the data sets. Which 3 markets increase based on the various tax rates would require the greatest change to be matched by domestic sales? Now we have to go back to the chart, and 2 minutes have passed. Most of us might be able to finish a test like this, I think, without sharpening your computational skills in 2 hours, and probably feel good, even though there were probably no differential equations to remember. But math skills and word problem interpretation skills are only sharpened with practice. Even somebody current and sharp with math and word problem and data analysis skills would barely finish one of these tests in an hour. If you could finish it and get it all right in 2 hours, you would fail, because you would only get 50% if you got them all right. And I think the standard is 70%. Although the standard is 70%, but if you get a 75, you're going to be interviewed differently than the gal who got 95. So you can see why taking one of these tests during your last year of business school, when you have been using such skills daily on similar problems, would be most people's most likely chance of success. Now, the best way to prepare for a quantitative test won't be found here at Manager Tools. Podcasts aren't the place for math and data analysis skill improvement, tip of the hat to Khan Academy, right? But if you want to do this, if you want to prepare, some firms share practice tests. McKinsey invented it. They're the 900-pound gorilla in the marketplace and in the interviewing marketplace. So go, take them. You won't know if you got a right answer, but you'll be able to hone in on what you'll need to do well. Practice computational skills. I have to tell you, caseinterview.com, from a guy who got an offer, Victor Chang, who got an offer from McKinsey and then went to work for them and later interviewed for them and has hundreds of case interviews under his belt. He wrote a great book about this called Case Interviews, The Secrets. There are others, but several business school graduates and consultants that we know have recommended caseinterview.com. And just signing up, you get more resources, more practice tests, and so on. Another thing you could do is to practice data and chart interpretation and word problem solving. I should have said this before, Mike. You could certainly practice estimation question problems. You could go gather 100 of them on the web and then practice doing them. And heck, we probably know somebody, if you wrote out your answer, would be willing to look at it and say, yeah, that's fine. That would be a good answer or not.
Do you recommend that people practice for interviews?
Only if the outcome is important. If the outcome's not important, no, don't practice.
Okay.
So there's a caveat. I mean, that eliminates a great number of people. Let me put it this way. If I were to go around telling people, I really recommend you practice for interviewing, I might as well be Cassandra. I mean, almost nobody practices.
Amazing.
I don't have to be the best guy for the job, because actually that's unknowable. I have to be the most prepared guy. And the great thing about being most prepared is I don't have to do very much. I really don't. I found out later that's why I did well when I interviewed, because I was more prepared.
There you go.
And the people I know that think of interviewing, no problem, I got that. There are two groups of people who say, no problem, I got that. The group of people who just think they're going to skate through, and they're either bluffing or they think that their charm and abilities will get them through. Or the other group, the group who prepares, who don't worry about this. Don't worry about it because, why worry if you've kept your powder dry?
Hey guys, if you have to do something like this, if you expect questions like this, go practice. I mean, I'd be doing hundreds of them, I swear, because otherwise I'd be awful. So
you could go out and practice data and chart interpretation and word problem solving. I got to tell you, I mentioned this before. I don't know why word problems are so disliked when they're taught in elementary and secondary schools. People say, oh my God, it's word problems. Oh, I hate this stuff. Okay, discussions, words, are often, almost entirely, not just often, but virtually every time, words are often how math problems are presented in real life. How many widgets do we need to sell to get a fixed cost ratio of less than 12% of total sales? It's a fairly straightforward calculation. If you've never been to business school, you never went to business class in undergraduate, and you don't know that, don't worry about it. That's not hard. It's not like your boss or the finance person is going to hand you the equation already written down like math tests do. The point of word problems is you have to create your own equation before you solve it. And I guess people don't like them because it's the combination of the equation creation and the solution. And hypothetically, you could solve your own equation correctly, but have written the equation down wrong. But your life in business is going to be a set of word problems. In fact, Mike and I, we do this all the time. We say, okay, hey, what is this number? Well, it's this. Well, what about that? Okay, how do we get to the other number? Okay, we do this and this and this. Hey, check my math. Yeah, that's good.
And by the way, this is the part that a computer can't generally do, right? They can solve the equation for you, but taking the word problem and turning it into equation, that generally requires a human being.
Exactly. Okay, something else you can do. The graduate record exam, the GRE, which is used for entrance to postgraduate schools, tests math and data analysis and word problem skills. There are tons of books and online tests you can take to practice. Khan Academy has resources here. And Kaplan in the US, the exam preparation company, and I'm pretty sure they're in Europe as well. And they're online as well. You can buy them online and take them. And guys, even full-time business school students, having spent much of their time with these skills, fail these tests. If you're experiencing estimation questions, legitimate estimation questions, because that would be a part of your job, or a quantitative test, your success is going to be the function of rigorous preparation. And by the way, looking at an estimation question and saying, well, I do this and this and this, and then I would do, and I do the math, I get this. You will fail in the interview if that's the way you do it. As we tell people in our interview series, one of the most popular products we have. It's amazing to me that there are 50 or 60 podcasts in it. It's only $150, I think. And one of the things we tell you is you actually have to record your answers. You can't just say them in your head. When you say them in your head, you assume all the words, but the recruiter's not going to hear anything but your words, and he certainly or she's not going to feel or hear your thoughts or your feelings. So you actually have to practice. We tell people, walk around with your phone, and in the beginning, just answer, tell me about yourself until you're totally comfortable with it. Believe me, you will not be able to sound rehearsed as if you're reading a script in a natural interview. It won't happen. You have my word. On the other hand, when you start getting to behavioral questions, practice until the structure is so comfortable and clear in your mind that it almost doesn't matter the words you use because the structure will be a result of your answer. The recruiter will feel your structure, and it will help even more if you give some metadata to the interviewer around your answer. It's all practice. And, what was it? I think I read something. Somebody was talking about Kobe Bryant, the LA Laker guy who's had such an incredible career. And they were a teammate of his. The guy heard of Kobe's legendary work ethic. And so one morning he showed up at the gym. I think practice started at 9. And the guy showed up at 6 and Kobe was already there. I think he was in the ice bath at the time or something like that. He says, God, I want to impress this guy. I want to be a key part of this team. I'm going to have a work ethic. I've always had a work ethic, but Kobe's famous. So he comes in at 5. Kobe's there. Finally, he comes in at 4:30 and Kobe's there. And he's like, do you know I'm going to keep coming early? He says, no, been here at 4 every morning. And you end up one of the 10 highest scorers of all time in the NBA. That's what it takes. And there are enough resources out there that can get you started. And then you'll have to pay for some. But if you're interviewing for a consulting job, for a strategic job, for a financial job, for a banking job, where these kinds of questions are used, absolutely necessary that you be comfortable with your process and the verbalization of your process. And that finishes with the quantitative part.
And we have situational case assessments to do. So let's not do that today. Let's do that on the next cast.
Hey everyone, Kate here. The latest update to the Manager Tools app includes the ability to track coaching and delegation with Roadmap. So if you're a licensed member, you can access Roadmap through the Manager Tools application. And now that app will track all of your Trinity behaviors, including coaching and delegation. Figure out who to coach and on what using Roadmap. It'll even walk you through the steps and help you to set goals and deliverables around coaching. You can also add photos of your notes to each coaching instance to keep track of your handwritten one-on-one notes for that particular coaching scenario. Use Roadmap to decide the who, what, and how of delegating to your team members, all within the recommended timeframes for Trinity rollout. We'll remind you when and how. It's like having the Trinity in your pocket.
Thanks, everyone. That's it for this week. We'll continue on this topic next week. In the meantime, have a great one. So long.